Hi, welcome to the Common Phases of Computer Forensics Investigation Models presentation. I'm Michael Corey, and I'm a part of Group 1, the only one. Our mission in this presentation is to go over the varying phases of computer forensics investigation models throughout the years and just see how the core components have changed and adjusted to our modern technology. While forensics investigations have been around for a few centuries with varying success, as our modern era increases its use in technology, so have criminals, and thus so will investigators. This burst of new technology and connections we had with the World Wide Web in the 80s pushed police investigators to include this technology into their everyday investigation, and eventually formed their own separate department for forensics of the computer, which later on required specific processes to properly investigate and assess these digital crime scenes. Thus, the many models computer forensic investigators have come up with over the years to help make this process more streamlined and easy to use. Without these models, it may make any of the evidence investigators found to not be up to par with the standards of the court, and thus not allowing these pieces of evidence to be used in court. And while these models do work for the intended audience and type of technology used in the collection of that evidence, it is always subject to change as our society pushes the boundaries on what is possible and what the public is allowed to use. There will be many diagrams and pictures shown throughout this presentation, and even though they may have different looks and words to describe the procedures, there should be three common words that can be used to describe all of them and not get confused with how different each one can be from the next. These three words are tasks, phases, and models. Tasks help us describe the activities that occur within each of the phases. A phase is used for a high-level component in the model that will be used throughout the investigation. And models are used to describe all of the activities occurring in one chain of investigations. And while there are many words being used in these tasks and phases, there are 8 common words that you should keep an eye out throughout this presentation. Those being accusation, identification, evaluation, admission, preservation, collection, examination, and analysis. These words come up in many different models and may have different roles or different effects depending on their placement within the model itself.
Computer Forensic Investigative Process of 1984. Figure 1 briefly illustrates the 4 phases involved in the process. The acquisition phase is where evidence is acquired in acceptable manner with proper approval from authority. Identification phase identifies the digital components from acquired evidence and converts it to readable format. The evaluation phase determines if components identified is relevant and considered legitimate evidence. And finally, the admission phase, the required and extracted evidence is presented in court. The Digital Forensics Research Workshop investigative model of 2001 consists of 6 phases instead of 4. There are 4 new phases introduced in this model. The preservation phase involves tasks such as setting up proper case management and ensuring an acceptable chain of custody. The collection phase is where relevant data are being collected based on approved methods and various recovery techniques. Finally, the examination and analysis phase involve tasks such as evidence tracing, evidence validation, recovery of hidden/encrypted data, data mining, timeline, and other things in that manner were also performed. The Abstract Digital Forensic Model of 2002 introduces 3 additional phases, making 9 total. The preparation phase includes activities such as preparing tools, identifying techniques, and getting management support. The approach strategy phase was introduced with the objective to maximize the acquisition of unattained evidence and at the same time to minimize any negative impact to the victim and surrounding people. Finally, returning evidence phase is to ensure that evidence are safely returned to the rightful owner or properly disposed.
The integrated digital investigation process was proposed in 2003. This process combines all of the investigative actions and steps into one integrated model. It also introduces the digital crime scene and the digital evidence of the cybercrime. So within this process, there are 4 key phases, all the way from readiness through deployment, into the physical and digital crime scene investigation, and lastly into the review. That readiness phase kicks off the process. This is where the people and equipment are prepared for the investigation. So this is also known as the operation and infrastructure readiness. And then this process can also trickle in throughout the other phases of the entire process as well, as more equipment and people are required and identified as needed throughout the process. That second phase is the deployment phase, where the crime is actually detected and confirmed. That leads you into the physical and digital crime scene investigation, where all of the evidence within the physical crime scene and the digital crime scene is collected and analyzed for the results. And these results are then analyzed within the review stage, where the entire process is reviewed, and here we can identify if there were any areas of opportunities or improvements and advancements for the process. The following process model takes it a step further than the integrated digital investigation process, and this is called the enhanced digital investigation process model. So that step further allows for the traceability of the crime back to devices, location, and even culprits. So you'll see here that within this process, there are the additional phases of traceback and dynamite. In this traceback phase, you'll see that you can find the tracking down of the crime scene. That includes any devices, any locations where the crime scene happened, or are attributed to certain pieces of the crime scene. And then that dynamite phase also identifies any potential culprits of the crime, motive, and etc. So the readiness, deployment, and review phase follow the same process phases as the integrated digital investigation process, and then this EDIP model just takes it one step further with that traceability piece. So the next model is the computer forensics field triage process model. So this is more for an on-site process. This allows for a faster, right on the site approach for the identification and analysis of the digital evidence that is found for a crime. So within this process, we have a planning and triage phase that kick it off. This is where the evidence is identified, and within that triage phase, the evidence needs to be prioritized because they are on site, they're moving to flow through this process in a quicker manner. So this evidence is prioritized in this phase. That then leads to the suspect profile and motive. So that is the user usage profile phase, where they, again, track location, file properties, registry, devices, etc. This then moves into the crime activities being sequenced and accounted for. So they build a chronological timeline within that phase to set up the sequence of crime events to further get a better feel for the actions that occurred. Then the internet involvement is determined in the internet phase. They examine which artifacts of the internet are related to the crime, whether it's browser within the crime was done via email, IM or any other means, and how those were connected to the crime, both individually and together. And then lastly, that last step of the process is the case specific phase, where the focus of the investigation is determined and can be adjusted and analyzed specific to the case itself. So the crime scene investigator can adjust the focus of the examination, dig into certain other pieces that may be specific to the crime in itself.
Here we have the digital forensic model based on the Malaysian investigation process. The difference here is planning is followed by reconnaissance, which is conducting investigation while devices are still in operation, similar to live forensics. Fragile evidence is acquired on live data, which makes positive prosecution more likely. Data must be transferred to the investigation site and stored. After storage, it moves to the analysis phase, using appropriate tools for whatever analysis they're doing. It then moves on to the proof and defense phase, because investigators must be able to show proof to support what they present in the case. Then in the archive storage phase, relevant evidence is saved for future reference and even training purposes. The authors chose not to go in depth on every available model, but instead chose to show how models have changed and developed over the years. So here are some examples provided. We have the scientific crime scene investigation model developed in 2001, which comprises of 4 phases: recognition, identification, individualization, and reconstruction. The end-to-end digital investigation model of 2003, which comprises of identification, preservation, collection, examination, analysis, then presentation. The extended model of cybercrime investigation from 2004 has multiple phases that are not necessarily sequential. As you see, some phases skip over other phases, and in one phase you can still return to previous phases as necessary. In 2007, the common process model for incident and computer forensics was developed with only 3 phases for smaller crime scales. The network forensic generic process model of 2010 has multiple phases, but similar to the extended model previously shown, phases are repeated throughout the investigation. All the investigation models presented have their differences. However, there are 5 key groups that have been identified where all phases of previously discussed models can be placed in. So there is a generic forensic investigation model that encompasses the phases of all the models, which is the pre-process, acquisition and preservation, analysis, presentation, and post-process. As you can see, to represent all the previous models, they can move sequentially and also go back to previous phases. As you can see, there are differences between the models, but there are also multiple similarities. So it is important to understand and identify common phases and phrases. The word model represents the entire activities performed in a computer forensic investigation. A phase represents the high-level component of the investigation. A task are activities to be performed in each phase. Pre-process are tasks that need to be done prior to the actual investigation and collecting data, like getting approval from proper authorities and setting up the tools needed to do the investigation. Acquisition and preservation is identifying, acquiring, collecting, transporting, storing, and preserving data to be made available for the next phases. Analysis is the focus of most models, with most of their phases falling under this group. Different types of analysis is performed on acquired data to identify the source of crime and discovering individuals responsible. Presentation is what is found in analysis, documentation, and presented to authority. Presentation must be done in a way that it can be understood by whom it is presented to, but also supported with adequate evidence. The purpose is to prove or deny allegations of criminal activity. And finally, Post-process is properly closing the investigation. Digital and forensic evidence must be returned to its proper owners and stored safely, and the investigation process is also reviewed to glean insight on what needs to be improved.